Welcome to In the Growth Space. This is the show for business owners and leaders who really have a thirst for growth. My name is David McGlennon, and I'm your host, and I really appreciate you listening in. Now, if this is your first time listening in, first of all, welcome. This podcast is all about growth. And I talk about business growth, I talk about team growth and personal growth. And I love talking with people who have gone through their own growth journey and who I really want to learn from. So it's kind of like free consulting for me, and I get to let you listen in as well. But today I'm talking with a friend of mine, Dr. Melissa Hughes. Melissa is a self-proclaimed neuroscience geek and the author of two best-selling books, Happy Hour with Einstein and Happier Hour with Einstein, Another Round. Dr. Hughes helps us to understand how the brain works and how to increase and optimize its function. She's a TED speaker, and we will link to her talk that she gave at a TEDx event dealing with our inner critic from a brain science perspective, because it is absolutely awesome. Melissa and I met through a mutual connection on LinkedIn, and I got to have a conversation with her on my prior version of my podcast. And I absolutely love Melissa's knowledge and her energy. And so I knew that this was going to be an amazing conversation because she really makes neuroscience understandable. And not only understandable, but super practical for all of us as leaders who want to grow their business and connect with their team and really create a culture of psychological safety. And we tap into that a little bit as well in our conversation. So today we're going to talk about how we can create the connection that we as humans are wired for, and what it takes to overcome the great resignation in your company. So let's go ahead and get into that conversation with Melissa Hughes now. Well, hey, Melissa, thank you so much for being on the podcast again. Actually, this is the second podcast that we've recorded together. So welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And I see that you got my black memo today. So we're, both wearing black. For those of you who are on YouTube, you can see we're twinsies.
Exactly. The good news is you don't have to wear black to listen to the podcast.
So. That's right. Exactly. Well, I'm really excited about this conversation today because, as we were talking before we hit record, I mean, you're one of those people that I just really love to talk with, especially around neuroscience. You're a neuroscience expert, and I just think that so much of what we as leaders need to understand is how our brain works. And this time of year, we're talking about goals and goal setting and, all of the new stuff that's around us with the pandemic and how we're adapting to change. I mean, our brain drives all of that, right? I mean, it's like, how do we use our brain to the best of our ability? And I think that's a really current topic that I think everybody's going to be interested in hearing about.
That's so true. All things being equal, it used to be you hired the best and the brightest, and there was a big difference in tools and technology, and we all have the same access to information. So now leaders have to focus on hiring the people who know how to get the information they need to get, not the people who already have that information, because we can't be experts in everything. And it's interesting, my journey in neuroscience started with, how can I be the best teacher I can be if I don't understand how the brain learns? And you can take that and extrapolate that out to leadership. How can I be the best leader I can be if I don't know what motivates my people, or more importantly, what demotivates my people? Because that it's equally as important to understand how people, those factors that help us learn and engage and contribute and be part of the team, and those factors that just kill all of those things.
Right? Yeah. Let's talk about that, because I mean, I think that's a really interesting topic, in that if we're working, we're remote. Some of us may be remote, some of us may be in person, with all of the kind of the new hybrid work. how do we create the environment and how do we overcome having some people who are virtual and some people who are in person and maybe let's talk about that a little bit. Like I guess what are some of our obstacles that we've got to overcome from a brain science perspective?
Such a good question. And it's so important right now, to your point about this hybrid world we find ourselves in. That's not going to go away. I think a lot of
Yeah.
companies have found that people want the flexibility. I mean, you look at the studies of the organizations that really thrived in the pandemic. The
Mm-hmm.
reason that they thrived is not because work stopped. They sent everybody home. People did their work from home,
Yeah.
but their emphasis then became creating a kind of culture that people needed to thrive.
Right.
So, most people can do their job if they have a computer and an internet
Yeah.
connection and a couple
You're good to
pens or
right.
whatever, right?
You're good to go.
We can do our jobs. The differentiating factor is, do we feel like we're contributing to a team? Do we
Yeah.
feel like our work is valued? Do we
Mm,
feel connected? Because
mhm.
we're wired to connect. And if we don't feel
Yeah.
connected, then we are not going to get to engagement and creativity and
Mm,
innovation and all of those things that leaders want from their people. So those, when you look at those companies that really did thrive, they said people can do their jobs from wherever, but that means our management, our leadership team has to do a reset. And
mm.
like, we cannot be micromanagers. Like,
Right.
we are not going to go, sit in the driveways of everybody's house and make
Knock on
sure
the
that
door.
you're
Yeah.
working.
Right.
Or when I ping you and you don't respond immediately, don't
Mm,
assume that that person is not working. Now, the
yeah.
flip side of that is, and this is all part of psychological safety.
Yeah. Right. Right.
The flip side of that is employees then also have ownership in what that looks like. So I'll
Yeah.
give you an example. If I, you give me, you're my supervisor, you give me a project, I work really hard on the project, I send the project back to you, we're virtual. So I don't see you. I don't have any visual cues of
Mm,
what's going on in your world. Like, I don't know
right.
if it's a hair on fire week,
Yeah.
or, if you're happy or if you're out. I don't know any
Mm-hmm.
of that. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sitting in my office doing my job, right?
Yeah.
I send you the project, you don't respond. Now, the way the brain works is we are predisposed to go to the absolute worst, predisposed for negativity. So
Mm,
I send it to you on Monday, you don't respond on Monday, you don't respond on Tuesday.
mm,
By
mhm.
Wednesday, David probably doesn't like my project. By Thursday, I'm pretty sure David doesn't like my project. By Friday, I've convinced myself that you hate my project. Not only do you hate my project, but you hate me, and I'm probably going to be fired
I'm
on
gonna
Monday.
get fired. Yeah. Right.
Okay? And all of that, there may be absolutely no truth in that whatsoever. And here's the
Yeah.
thing: if you're my leader and I did a terrible job on that project, if you're any kind of leader whatsoever, you're not going to just say, you're not worth the time for me to help you do that project better. You're going to
Yeah.
take the time. You're going to give me quality feedback. You're going
Right.
to sit down and say, this is not what I was looking for. Maybe I didn't explain it right here. Let me tell you what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Or, hey, this is almost there, a couple tweaks, and we can get there this way. I mean,
Yeah.
either way, it doesn't matter, because what matters is the way I'm perceiving this dynamic.
Yeah.
And I think what people forget, all of us forget, is in the virtual world, we are missing all of those social cues. Because
Mm,
had I sent you that when we were in the office on Monday, and I can see that there are all kinds of people in the office, and your bosses are in the office, and so you're
sure.
tied up in all of these meetings, and maybe there was some fancy lunch catered, and I'm thinking, oh, there must be some really important people in the office today. Now, I'm not going to jump to that conclusion that my work was terrible.
Right.
Now I have a few more data points to add to the story. David's
Right.
busy and he
Mm-hmm.
just hasn't gotten there yet. And if I pass you in the hallway, I could say, hey, David, did you get that email? I sent that project you were looking for. And you could say, oh my gosh, I've been so busy. I just haven't gotten there yet. Thank you. I did see it and I'm sorry I haven't responded. perfectly reasonable, logical, like we're humans, we
Yeah.
can't do it all. Except for all of those things now are taken out of the equation. And I am left with, you hate my work,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right. Right. So without those social cues and without some of those other cues, then our we can get to a really bad place in a hurry, right?
Mhm.
And so how do we best then and I'm going to come back to this connection piece, but how do we best then as a leader, how do we best overcome that or at least mitigate that negativity bias that our brains want to go to?
So there are, first of all, information is everything.
Yeah.
Communication is everything. I mean, you look at any study out there, and people want to be supported, respected. They want transparency. They want to know what's going on. Like, we don't like the unknown. We
Mhm.
don't like uncertainty. Think about the last 2 years of our
Yeah.
lives have been filled with uncertainty.
Uncertainty, yeah.
And the brain hates uncertainty because I mean that's our evolutionary hand me down. Like our
Yeah.
cavemen didn't like not knowing what was around that next cave.
Yeah.
Like they wanted to know what was around that next cave because it was a matter of life or death. While uncertainty is not necessarily that fatalistic, we still don't like it. And we've
Yeah.
dealt with it now for 2 years. So the one thing that leaders can do is to do their best. Now, you can't take away all uncertainty, but do
Right.
your best to minimize the
Mm.
uncertainty. The other
Mhm.
thing to know about uncertainty is there have been studies done. So there was a really cool study done, and the participants played this computer game.
Hmm.
They were hooked up to this minor yet painful electric shock. So it doesn't sound much like a game yet,
Yeah.
but it was all in the name of science. So they're playing this game and they had to click on these rocks on the computer. And if, when they clicked on the rock would move. And if underneath the rock there was a snake, they got an electric shock.
Oh gosh.
If they picked up the rock and there was no snake, they got no shock.
Mm.
And then sometimes they would be able to see there was like a little clue that there was a snake there.
Mm.
Now, they're still going to get the shock, but guess what happens when they get that shock and they anticipate that shock
Mm.
is coming? It's not as painful.
Yeah, because they
So
could predict it. Okay.
that's right.
Mm.
So our stress of uncertainty peaks when it's at about 50%. So
Okay.
when you think about you're heading to, I am one of those people, I hate to be late. I
Mhm.
hate to be late. So you're heading to a meeting starts at 2 o'clock. You give yourself plenty of time, maybe even enough time to grab a Starbucks before the meeting, right?
Yeah, sure.
Uh, GPS says you should be there at 1:40. Perfect. I'm in
Yeah.
perfect shape. You hit a traffic jam. Now you watch the GPS go, ETA is now 143. ETA is now 148. ETA is now 150.
My
And the
blood pressure is
closer,
rising as you're saying that.
that's right. As you get closer to that time where you can just make it, your
Mhm.
anxiety level is rising. And what happens in your brain when anxiety increases? Cortisol increases. And what
Ah,
happens when cortisol increases? Activity in the prefrontal cortex decreases. So
decreases, yeah.
the brain literally says, danger, cortisol is flowing. That means there's danger ahead. That means I
Mhm.
need to shut down the part of the brain that doesn't need to help me survive, which is the
Mhm.
thinking brain. The survival brain
Yeah.
needs to be in charge right now. So it literally pauses activity in the thinking brain to allocate all of the neural resources so that you can survive. When you get to that point where the GPS says, if this traffic jam opens up right now and you leave right now, you will get there at 2 o'clock. That is the peak of stress.
Yeah.
Once you get past that and you go, I'm not going to make it, I'm going to be late, guess what? The anxiety starts to go down, the stress starts to go down because then you know you're not going to make it. And then you go, now I
Interesting.
can call, I can send a text, I can let them know I'm stuck in a traffic jam,
Yeah.
whatever it is. But it's the not knowing piece that's
Mm.
so unsettling to us.
Mm.
Once we know, knowing bad news is
Yeah.
far better than not knowing bad news.
Yeah. So as I'm hearing this and I'm thinking about it from a leadership perspective, then communicating any news, whether it's bad news, whether it's good news, whether it's neutral news, just that communication is going to give that predictability to our people and our teams, and let them know that X is going to happen or Y might happen, but whatever. But it's going to give that predictability and relieve some of that uncertainty is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
That's exactly it. There's a construct called emotional intensification,
Hmm.
and it's surprise is good when it's good, surprise is horrible when it's bad. So
Yeah.
think about if you get flowers on your birthday. You
Hmm.
anticipate those flowers maybe
Yeah.
coming on your birthday because it's your birthday.
Yeah.
And when you get those flowers are nice. I mean, that was
Yeah.
really nice to get
Sure.
those flowers. But let's say you get flowers on some random Tuesday just
Yeah.
because, just because I love you. And the men listening to this podcast right now
Take a note.
should be dialing their florist as we speak,
Exactly. Exactly.
because getting random flowers on some random Tuesday, that surprise factor is what creates this emotional intensification. And we can experience emotional intensification up to 400%. Like
Wow.
that emotion can be 400% more intense than when it's predicted.
That's
Now,
predictable.
that bad emotion can also be amplified up to
Mm.
400%. So let's
Wow.
let's say last year we had lots of, let's take the restaurant industry. A
Yeah.
lots of restaurants, had to close.
Right.
They had to go, they had to do takeout only or pickup only, or then they were at 50% capacity. Now they're back to 25% capacity. I mean, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I mean, there was some, like, we don't know what's going on, but there was still some sense of predictability. So
Yeah.
when people came in and the boss had to say, listen, you guys, we can't stay open. We're going to have to close for a month or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. There was some sense that that was coming.
Mm-hmm.
Compare that to you walk into the office one day and HR is standing by your cubicle with a cardboard box.
Yeah.
Had no idea that was coming. The emotional intensification of that is far worse than if you had some sign, if you had some signal that it was coming.
That was coming. Yeah. Wow. I think this is really a great lesson for every leader and really parents and all friends to be able to make sure that we're communicating and giving people, even if we don't know what's going to happen, we can at least reach out and communicate and give some ability or some certainty to the other person. I always think about just kind of in the example you used at the beginning. You submitted a project, you didn't hear anything. It's always nice just to be able to have somebody reach back and say, hey, I got it, busy week, I'll be back to you by Friday. Something along those lines, just to be able to give that predictability so that you don't go in your mind to that negative place. And I just think that's something that as a leader we need to do.
It's so true. I wrote a piece a while back and I included these common behaviors, not just leadership behaviors, but
Yeah.
just common behaviors that often get lost in translation, especially in this virtual space.
Yeah.
So I'll give you another example. If my boss never asks me for suggestions or, hey, what do you think about this? Or here's this problem. Do you have any ideas of how we might solve this problem? The translation to me is, well, he must not think that I'm smart enough to come up with anything.
Yeah.
And the flip side is he might be saying, God, I just don't want to bother her with that. Like, I don't want to put one more thing
mm,
on her plate. Like,
right.
I don't believe that leaders wake up in the morning and say, how can I make this day the most miserable for the
Right.
most amount of people?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
I think leaders wouldn't be leaders if they didn't have some sense of wanting to help other people succeed. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a key
Yeah.
leadership characteristic is you want the people around you to succeed.
Sure.
So that's one thing that gets lost in translation. Like there was here we are in the virtual world. If
Yeah.
you and I schedule a Zoom meeting
Hmm.
for 9:30 and I show up at 9:30 and I'm left in your waiting room,
Yeah.
maybe you're really busy, maybe you're stuck in traffic, I don't know.
Yeah.
But what gets lost in translation for me is the reality, because
Yeah.
where my brain goes is he doesn't think I'm important. He doesn't think what I do is important.
Yeah.
You know, like, would you leave someone sitting in a conference room for a half an hour while you
Right.
did whatever you were doing? I mean, you
Yeah.
wouldn't do that in the face-to-face world. And so I think,
Mm.
it's the difference between when you send a text, you expect an immediate response. When you send an email, you don't.
Yeah. Right.
When we have a meeting set in the office in the conference room B,
Yeah.
you expect people are going to show up to conference room B. But when we
Right.
set a Zoom meeting and people don't show up, and then you go, I mean, how many people have said over the last year, what's the appropriate amount of time you should wait for
To
somebody in a
wait.
Zoom meeting before you bail?
Right. Right.
Right? I
Yeah.
mean, I've had
Yeah.
that conversation with a
Of
lot of
course.
people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think that kind of coming back to something you said earlier, I mean, this really makes connection even more important. And so you talked about us as humans being wired for connectivity. And I think that it's one of the reasons why that I've created these inner circles for leaders and people who want to grow to connect and to be with other leaders who are on that growth journey. How do we best then, given all of this information with communication and our negativity bias, how do we best then connect with others? How do we best connect in this virtual world?
I think number one, remember that we are still trying to connect. We still need to connect. And just because we're virtual doesn't make our role any less significant. So I think
Yeah,
making
that's
sure
good.
that people know, well, even though I'm sitting in my home office, what I am doing for the organization matters.
Matters.
And that
Yeah.
can be something as simple as checking in at the beginning of the Zoom call and saying, hey, how are you? No, I mean,
Yeah.
really, how are you?
Yeah.
If I'm walking through the office and again, it's those social visual cues that are missing,
Yeah.
and I'm having a really tough time. Maybe somebody at home is sick, or maybe, it could be a
Yeah.
million things. I mean, we all have lives outside of this
Hmm.
space called being an employee, right? And
Yeah.
so you would be able to tell by my body language, or
Yeah.
I mean, a million things would tell you I'm really struggling. And if you're a caring, empathetic individual, you would say, hey, everything okay? Like, you don't have to share the personals.
Yeah.
I'm here if you need to talk, or
Yeah.
you're doing okay. And I think the other piece that has really become apparent to me in this whole pandemic thing is I've talked to a lot of leaders who say, I don't have the answers. I don't know what's coming next.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I get that. And I think for those leaders who don't want to say, I don't know,
Hmm.
that doesn't help,
Sure.
because we have kind of a BS meter
Right.
that we
Yeah.
can tune into that really fast. And
True.
the best thing you can do for your folks is to admit when you don't know. Like, if there
Yeah.
is this big unknown sitting out there, say, I don't know. It could go
Yeah.
this way, it could go this way, it could go this way. What do you think we should do in the meantime? Like, ask
Yeah.
your people
Yeah.
to help with suggestions, help find
Mhm.
resolutions, even if it's just getting to tomorrow. Like,
Yeah.
not always going to solve that big thing,
Mhm.
but if you ask folks, what do you need to make today better to get to tomorrow?
Yeah.
And give them a sense of ownership, because the only way that they get a sense of ownership is if they contribute.
Yeah. Yeah.
If there is no contribution, then there is no ownership. If you
Yeah.
think of, we learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs a long time ago, like
Yeah.
1963, I think, or some
Yeah.
craziness. But, it was physiological needs,
Yeah.
food, shelter, oxygen, water, and then safety needs, like I'm not in danger.
Yeah.
And then the third one is belonging. And
Mm.
then the fourth one is self-esteem. And then the fifth one is self-actualization. And when you
Yeah.
think about that, when you align that in an employee engagement framework.
Yeah.
The physiological, the bottom is they get enough pay to pay the
Yeah.
bills. They're
Hmm.
there to get paid. The
Right.
second is they're safe. They're not being, there's no harassment. There's safe working conditions. Right now, it's about being sanitary and all of those things, right?
Hmm.
Third one is still belonging. Do I
Yeah.
belong to this team? Do I feel
Yeah.
a connection with people? Do people, really care about me as a person? Do I care
Right.
about other people? The
Yeah.
fourth one is self-esteem. Am I recognized for my work? Am I
Hmm.
appreciated for my work? Do people ask me for my opinion?
Hmm.
That makes me feel good. Does my boss recognize my efforts in front of my peers?
Right.
Because studies show that that is worth more than money, because
Yeah.
that's a social status. Now, that social status is also a currency. So
Yeah.
now you've elevated my social status. And then the last one is self actualization. What can I learn? What can I teach? And
Mm.
get to that place of self actualization, and everyone is, what can I learn? What can I teach? Well, now you're a growth mindset organization.
Golly, that's so great. I'm so glad that you went there because when everybody is on that level playing field and we're all working our way up those levels of needs, I think that's when we can truly have an organization that is going places. And and one of the things I was going to say earlier, my train of thought did come back around the loop because you were talking about a leader not wanting to admit that they don't know what's coming next. And I think that that contributes to the psychological safety if a leader admits that and says, hey, I honestly don't know what's going to happen. And like you said, this could happen, and then asking, well, what do you think? That to me is a contributor to psychological safety
Absolutely.
and building trust within a team as well, because leaders don't always have the answers, and
No.
that's why we need a team, because we have to have all of these perspectives. And so I think that to that extent, then if we can all help each other, then with being connected to them, having a relationship with each of our teammates and helping each other go up that level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's what's going to help us to perform better and as an organization really achieve the mission that we're out to achieve.
So true. When you think about individual success, competence,
Yeah.
effectiveness, productivity, whatever word you want to put in there, and then organizational success,
Yeah.
productivity, effectiveness. So the best way to make someone feel like it's safe, and this is part of psychological safety. There are four quadrants of psychological safety, but one is learning safety. It's
Hmm.
safe for me to raise my hand and say, I don't understand. I
Yeah.
have a question. I need clarity on
Hmm.
this project. Or, and it doesn't have to be that big thing looming on the horizon. It could be the thing I'm working on today.
Yeah.
And when you talk to people who are thinking about leaving, it's, I don't feel like I'm being used the
Mm.
up to my ability. I
Yeah.
don't feel like I'm appreciated or valued or respected for the strengths that I bring, or I don't feel like I have the freedom to say, I don't know how to do this thing that I'm
Yeah.
expected to do. And so I muddle
Mm.
through it on my own. And then in my head, I know that it's not going to be right, So that's one thing. So the best way to get people to feel comfortable saying, I have a question, is for leaders to say, I don't know the answer to this thing. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
there's a vulnerability and a humility in that, and it's kind of counterintuitive, because
Yeah.
we as leaders like to think, well, we can't say that we don't know what we're doing. We can't admit that we don't know the answer.
Right.
But to your point, I'm a good leader because I have an amazing team around me. And
Exactly.
if I'm not going to utilize that amazing team when I need help,
Yeah.
then how do I expect them to utilize each other when they
Yeah.
need help? Because that is the difference between a genius mentality and a growth mentality. Like the
Hmm.
genius mentality in the organizational mindset is you got to be the smartest guy in the room. It's every man for himself. And I
Yeah.
sure as hell am not going to raise my hand and give you a bad idea or
Yeah.
the wrong answer. And what we know about innovation is the bad idea flipped on his head is often the best
The
idea
best
in the
idea.
world.
Yeah. Yeah. No
Right?
doubt.
And then the other piece I just wanted to bring out that you sparked was, mistakes. Do people feel like in that learning safety, do people
Yeah.
feel they are free to share mistakes with other
Right.
people? So if you have 20 people on your team and one person makes a mistake and keeps that mistake to himself because he doesn't feel free to share it, like he doesn't want
Yeah.
anybody to know that he screwed up and made that mistake. Now, 19 other people could potentially make that same mistake. But if there is a psychological safety in the group, there's
Hmm.
trust,
Hmm.
people have that, feel that freedom to say, hey, I screwed up and I'm sharing this with all of you because I don't want anybody else to make this mistake. And
Yeah.
that person is celebrated
Yeah.
for not chastised for making the mistake, but celebrated because they were brave enough to share that with everyone else so no one else has to make that same mistake. The
Yeah.
organization benefits. That's a win for the organization.
Absolutely.
But so many of us think of mistakes as bad,
Yeah.
and they're only bad if no one can learn from them.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was gonna say too, is that when we fail, when we make a mistake, that's our greatest learning opportunity, and it's really one of the reasons why when I'm working with an organization and we're talking about cultural behaviors, I almost always require them to put in a fundamental or a behavior of practicing blameless problem solving because it does contribute to the psychological safety of an organization. And if we practice blameless problem solving, we're looking at the what and not the who. And if we're looking at the what, then we can figure out, was this a process issue? Was is it a process issue that wasn't followed? How do we prevent this from happening again? And then what do we learn from that so that we can get smarter next time? And so I think that a lot of organizations think that they've got to be perfect all the time. And that's just not true.
Yeah, it's the difference between blame and accountability. If
Right.
I make a mistake, I'm going, and the standard in our organization is such that I hold myself accountable, then I'm going to raise my hand and say, I made this mistake. I own
Yeah.
it.
Yep.
And I want to share it because I have enough respect for my colleagues that I don't want anyone else to make this same mistake. The
Exactly.
best way for a leader to promote that kind of mentality is to share mistakes. I
Yeah.
had a boss one time, and I will never forget. He came into my office. He was the CEO. I was director of marketing communications. He came into my office. He was like, "Oh my gosh, I totally screwed up, and the task doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
Can you help me?" Of course. What? Yes, of course. And so he shows me the thing, and I help him fix it. And I spend like I was going to spend as long as it took to get him out of the weeds on that
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And when I did, he was so grateful and he was so appreciative. But what elevated me more than the after the fact gratitude was the fact that he trusted me enough to say, I screwed up and I need
Yeah.
help.
Hmm.
Because that is not the person we want to put out for the world to see. We want to put the
Yeah.
confident person out there, like, I got it
Right.
all buttoned up, right?
Right. Right.
And I never worked harder for anyone than I did for that man.
Yeah.
Because, he put his pants on one leg at a time, just like me, and he trusted me.
Yeah.
And there's a neurological golden rule that says if I trust you, then my brain is going to produce oxytocin, and I am going to treat you in a way that you can trust me.
Oh, yeah.
And it is really true. If you really want to take this to the next level, like dig into organizational trust. Paul Zak
Yeah.
has done a lot of work with trust, but it all psychological safety is kind of sits on that pillar of trust. And if
Right.
people don't trust that they can make a mistake, or that they
Hmm.
can ask a question, or that they could share something that they've learned, then there is no trust.
Right,
They
right.
just don't trust the people around them.
Well, and I think that everything that we're talking about here today is really the antidote for the great resignation. Everybody's right now kind of thinking about, well, what else is out there and what, maybe I'm going to go someplace where I do feel valued. Well, the antidote to that feeling is to build trust and to grow psychological safety within our organizations. And when we do that, then we're going to prevent this turnover and this loss of great talent that we have that maybe we've overlooked. And I think that this is, the brain science behind this is something that we can all use to make sure that our organizations are operating at their best capacity and fulfilling our mission as well.
Yeah, when you realize what's going on inside the brain of an engaged employee, it has little to do with what they're doing, but it has everything to do with this kind of circular kind of process of teaching and learning. People who are really engaged are sponges to learn more, and they want
Hmm.
to do better, and they're like, they don't just celebrate the things they do really well, they want to kick it up a notch.
Yeah.
And those are the folks that are really engaged. And to do that, you have to be both a teacher and a learner. But if you think
Hmm.
about the traditional model of mentorship, the traditional model of mentorship is the old guys at the top taught the young guys at the bottom, and everybody
Yeah.
had their place.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, why bother bringing in those bright young people if you're not going to tap into them and let them be teachers too?
True. Yeah. Yeah.
So let
Yeah.
those new, I'm going to say it, let those new kids show off,
Yep.
like, because they do have skills that we don't have. They grew up in a
Absolutely.
completely different world. So everybody needs a place to shine and
Mm.
teach and learn.
Yeah.
And I think the leaders set the tone for that by saying, help me learn something, teach
Yeah.
me something.
Mm.
When you give in the classroom, it's a classic teaching strategy. You give the kid who is kind of at a C the task of teaching everybody else, because guess what, in order for that kid to teach that thing, he's got to
I
know
gotta
that
know
thing.
it. Yeah. Yeah.
So in the process of him learning how to teach it, he's learning it.
Right. Isn't that, yeah. So as a leader, when we allow our new people, our young people to be able to teach us, we're helping them to learn some things as well. And I think that's the
Absolutely.
beautiful thing. Yeah, that's so great. Melissa, I could go on for hours talking about this because I think that when we understand our brain and the brain science, it can help us so much, not only in our own growth journey, but in the growth of our organizations. And I think that that is something that if great leaders want to grow their company and they want their people to grow, then they got to understand the neuroscience behind humans. I mean, because let's face it, organizations are humans, right?
That's
And
right.
so tell everybody how they can connect with you. Before we started recording, I was talking about your newsletter. You've got an amazing newsletter. I always read it. And so how can people connect with you?
Well, you can sign up. So I send a Neuro Nugget out. I try to send it out every Friday. It doesn't always happen every Friday, so forgive me if I miss a week. But it is not salesy at all. I am a
Nope.
terrible salesperson, just so you know. I don't do that well, but I do give you some little Neuro Nuggets about some fascinating factoid about the brain and how to make it work better. So you can sign up for that on my website, which is melissahughes.rock.
Love it. MelissaHughes.rocks. I forgot about the about the dot part. Yeah, rocks. Okay, cool. Awesome. We will put that in the show notes as well. And I want to tell everybody as well. So Melissa, we didn't even talk about this, but Melissa did a TED Talk last year, and it was amazing. For those of you who are in the emerging leader inner circle, you know that we talk about imposter syndrome. It's an amazing talk on imposter syndrome and that inner dialogue. So I just want to make sure you go out And we'll probably link to that. No, not probably. We will link to that as well because it's a great talk. And I was so proud of that talk because I thought, boy, this is something that everybody needs to know.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thanks again for being here, taking the time out of your day to share with our community, and really grateful to learn from you as always.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you, David.
Well, I knew this was going to be such a great conversation with Melissa, and there were really so many great takeaways for leaders in learning to use our brain and the neuroscience around it. Because if we're going to overcome the obstacles in our environment right now, the hybrid work world, the great resignation, we're going to have to use those. And so being able to apply some of the things that we talked about in this conversation to allow for and create psychological safety and a thriving culture is really important. And I thought that there were a couple of key takeaways that stood out to me, at least. And first and foremost, I thought was just the fact that as human beings, we are all wired to connect. And so that feeling of connection, if we want to overcome this great resignation, if we want to mitigate some of the things that are leading to resignations right now, we have to make sure that our people feel connected. And we certainly, as leaders, cannot be micromanagers in this environment. We have to be able to trust our employees. And quite honestly, that's another element of what we talked about, is just that trust and bringing that level of trust to all of our relationships. And as employees, we have ownership in this environment too. And we have to be able to understand the context that we're in and understand our natural bent towards that negativity and that negativity bias. And, as a leader, I just think that being able to communicate in this environment is such a key component for this ability to really stem the tide of this great resignation, and really learning to be proactive and reaching out to overcome that lack of our visual cues and our social cues that from being in the office that Melissa talked about, I think is really important. I think that being able to proactively talk about things that are coming or that are challenging us as an organization, and paying attention to that level of uncertainty in the organization is something that we as leaders need to be doing. We need to learn to communicate, again, proactively, just to help provide some of those levels of certainty, at least where you can. I mean, and I thought the interesting thing was that she shared was that even if it's bad news, that and any kind of surprise is amplified. So surprise that's really good, it's really good. And when surprise is bad, it's really bad. And so I think that just being aware that our common behaviors that get lost in translation is really important. So just be aware, leaders, as you navigating leadership in this new environment. And then, just enduring trust and building trust within an organization, within a team, within leaders. It requires being vulnerable and admitting when we don't know something and asking for help. I've talked about that a number of times, but leaders who are humble are going to build trust and provide that psychological safety for their team. And really, it's all about having those relationships with our people. And when you do that, when you have relationships with your people and you build those relationships and you really connect on a human level, you're going to be able to build that growth mindset into your organization, which of course will then allow you to grow at a much better pace. Just another note here, I think that's really important from this conversation, being able to share mistakes and practice that blameless problem solving that I talked about is going to provide that safety net and that safe psychological safety within your organization. It's also going to help to grow trust, because when we are at a place where we are able to admit our mistakes, then we can trust each other. And I loved that neurological golden rule that she shared, that if I trust you, my brain will create oxytocin, and then I'm going to treat you in a way that you can trust me. And then that then provides more psychological safety. It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy and a self-fulfilling process. So I just think that this conversation was really key to allow us to understand some brain science and really create the antidote to the Great Resignation. And, I think that her point about everybody needing a place to shine, allow your people to show off and shine, leaders. Trust them, give them opportunities, and allow them to really be able to be fulfilled within your organization. I just want to offer my thanks again to Melissa for joining me on this conversation. She's really a wealth of knowledge. I hope that you'll go out and check her information out. Sign up for her newsletter. Like I said in the session, I read it every Friday. It's a great neuro nugget, I think is what she calls it, and it's a great piece of neuroscience every Friday. And you can do that by going to melissahughes.rocks. I love that domain, .rocks. melissahughes.rocks. We'll put that in the show notes as well. So thanks again for joining me here on this edition and this episode of In the Growth Space. Until next time, stay in that growth space and be well.